Very much for coming out today. For some of you, this is the first time you've been to a Center for European Studies event. So maybe this is the first time that you're finding out that there is, in fact, a Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. So I encourage you, if you're interested in European studies more generally, to make sure that you look us up. There's a lot of information about the center out front. We are also extremely easy to find. We're just ces@ufl.edu. So we encourage you to go ahead and find us. We have a lot of opportunities for undergraduates, graduates. We have a lot of events happen open to the general public, so there's lots to do, including ongoing European Cinema Festival out on Plaza de Americas, a European Horror Fest at Depot Park the night before Halloween. And this talk today, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about, is actually part of a 4-part program on the Prague Spring. And while you've missed the first 2 parts, you're here for the 3rd, and you have the opportunity to also partake in the 4th, which will be on October 27th, actually on a Saturday at 2 p.m. in 215 Dower, and that will be a roundtable or a panel with Czech and Slovak emigres who actually have personal accounts of both the Prague Spring and the process of normalization that came after the Prague Spring. So it's a really unique opportunity to meet with people who lived either through the actual event of the Prague Spring or through the aftermath of the Prague Spring and what that meant for their lives as they went through that process. And if you're interested in that, there are flyers which have all of the information just outside, so you can pick them up as you leave, and they conveniently have information on European Horror Film Festival at Depot Park as well, and all of the contact information you might need for the center. All right, so it's a single stop there. So enough about the center generally. My task today, quite pleasurable, is to introduce you to Dr. Bren. Dr. Bren received her bachelor's degree in the College of Letters program at Wesleyan University, after which she completed a master's degree in Russian and East European Studies at the University of Washington as a Jackson Fellow, and she then went on to do her PhD in Modern European History at NYU as a McCracken Fellow. She has been the recipient of many awards. I will name a few. She was a Fulbright Hayes Foundation recipient, Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, and most recently, the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's held residencies at the Bill and Carol Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Emory University and the Institute for Advanced Study in Budapest. Her book, The Greengrocer and His TV, won the 2012 Council for European Studies Book Prize and the 2012 Austrian Studies Book Award, and was shortlisted for the 2011 Wayne Kucinich Prize. In addition, we argued about how to spell that, how to pronounce it.
You said it well.
All right. In addition to her 2 books, she's also published a wide range of essays on post-war Europe, particularly on the politics of everyday life in the Eastern Bloc. And most recently, The Greengrocer and His TV was published in Czech language translation. So for those of you who are studying Czech with Dr. Reynard, perhaps you'll have the opportunity to look at that book in Czech. And so, without further ado, I'd like to have Dr. Bren begin her talk to you, and I will go slink off into the corner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for European Studies, all those people over there, for inviting me, and I'd like to thank you for being here at 6 o'clock. I do know some of you are here because your professors suggested you come here. So I'm just curious, just to give me a sense of how many of you know something about Eastern Europe and communism? How many of you are here more in terms of courses you're taking on journalism media? Okay, so I'm going to try to keep that in mind as I speak, but I'm also going to try to leave a large amount of time at the end for questions and answers, so feel free to ask questions, okay? And I'm really also grateful that these series of events on the Prague Spring that the Center is doing, that they don't leave the Prague Spring in 1968 as this static event, sort of suspended in time, and that they're including this period of normalization, which I'll be talking about today. In other words, understanding that what came after was a response also to the Prague Spring. I'm going to start by talking about what we'd like to imagine late communism was all about. When I say late communism, I mean this: post-1968 communism in the Eastern Bloc, post-Prague Spring, basically the 70s and 80s before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in Czechoslovakia, this was called normalization, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And if you think about it, late communism really constitutes the second half of post-war communism. Okay? So that's late communism. Václav Havel. Anybody has heard the name Václav Havel? Not many people. He was a very famous political dissident, not just in Czechoslovakia, but he sort of represented dissent, political resistance in the communist bloc in the 70s and 80s. Famous playwright, wrote some of the most interesting works also on questions of resistance. Okay? And when I talk about resistance, I mean the usual idea has been until recently that this period of late communism was in a sense synonymous with political dissent. Okay, so basically the Prague Spring comes, everybody's excited. There's a sense that yes, we can reform communism, we can turn it into something that is socialism with a human face. We can humanize it, we can make it better and kinder. Soviet invasion comes to completely obliterate the Prague Spring. And then sort of the mythology that emerged was that the 70s and 80s were all about resisting the communist regime that was put in power by the Soviets, or put back in power by the Soviets after 1968. So that dissent was made up, again, you see Václav Havel there on the top, and he was the sort of the head, there were different spokespersons, but he was sort of the symbolic head of an association called Charter 77. And then there was also what was called the underground, so the cultural underground. Myths around that exist as well, that somebody managed to get the ear and used it as sort of like a outside fountain bathtub in their yard. I'm sure that's just a rumor. And the plinth, so once Stalin was exploded, the plinth remained empty. Remained empty from that point on, from 1961 until actually 1996, when, does anybody know who that is? Michael Jackson? Michael Jackson was in Prague doing his tour of, it was called His Story. So he was doing a tour in Prague, and his publicity people thought it would be a great idea to put up a huge Michael Jackson where Stalin had once stood. What I want to say here is that I do think actually this empty plinth from 1961 to the end of communism in 1989 does speak volumes. Sort of its absence, its complete emptiness, really is a metaphor for late communism. It speaks to the confusion felt by the Czechoslovak leadership, not only after the death of Stalin, but even more pressingly after the death of the Prague Spring. Although this period became known as normalization, but sort of what was the normal of the abnormality of normalization? And in a sense, this empty plinth really asks that question. So if most people were not dissenting, what were they doing? Well, they were doing what people do. They were going to work, looking after their kids, making plans for the weekends, and they were watching TV. By 1972, 80% of Czechoslovak households had a TV. By the 1980s, everyone pretty much had access to a TV or had a TV. So you're looking at a huge TV viewing public here. And this is also, I know you can't possibly remember this. This was, it was a time when you had a TV, there was no remote control, there were, in this case, I think 2 channels. So you were very much, if you're watching TV, you're very much a hostage to that TV. And so that's important to remember. You don't get to flick channels, you don't have cable. So how can TV tell us something about late communism that, in a sense, the far more interesting writings of the dissidents can't? So I'd say, first of all, unlike dissident activities and dissident writings, TV was accessible to everybody. And that was really important. The Charter 77, as I said, the key dissident organization, no more than 1,000 people ever signed it, which is a minute number. And there were different reasons for it, but one of them was, it's not as if there was a booth that you could go to and just sign up to be a dissident. It helped if you were in Prague and you had to know somebody. So to talk about sort of dissident life and dissident writings as representing the public at large, that's really hard to say, whereas TV was accessible. It's something that everybody had. Importantly too, TV was a regime-engineered medium, okay? All TV, all newspapers, all literature, that was all controlled by the state. And I think it's important because often when sort of the history of dissent is seen as the history of the 1970s and 1980s in the Eastern Bloc, there's this idea that simply the regime is oppressive, communist regime. And yes, of course, but 70s and 80s were a time where things were less black and white, things were gray. And so it's important not to exclude sort of the way that the regime itself had to negotiate with the public. Television was also a medium that was shaping society in the West as well as the East. This was 70s and 80s as a time when consumption and media started to influence our identities beyond politics. The way we think about things and the way we group ourselves with other people. And this phenomenon, it's important to realize, was happening behind the Iron Curtain as well. It was happening in the Eastern Bloc as well. So let's return for a moment to the Prague Spring. So during the Prague Spring, radio was still very much dominant, but this is when TV started to really come into its own. It was its political debut. In 1968, during the Prague Spring, the late Oxford historian Z.A.B. Zeman came back to Prague. He'd escaped as a student after World War II with the onset of communism, and he came back to Prague in 1968, and he wrote a lovely short sort of book about his experience there. And one of the things he wrote was this: as rebellion flickered across the television screen in the lobby of my hotel, the staff, the drivers whose taxis stood deserted, and the Czech-speaking guests came to watch it. Public questioning of members of the party, the government, the army, with a few writers thrown in, was the most popular pastime those days, which meant people were going to their TVs in 1968 during the Prague Spring, and they were hungry for all this new information that was appearing, where now a politician would get on TV and they'd be interviewed, and it was no longer a set sort of questions and obvious answers. They were grilled. They were argued with. It was a very exciting time. And television was able to portray this in a way that radio obviously could not. And then came the invasion, which meant that those who retook power in 1968 with the help of Moscow, for them, television represented both the bane of their existence, but also their potential hope that they could now harness that same power of television as the reformed communists had during the Prague Spring. These are just so you have a sense of the old fogies who returned to power. So this is Vassar, who became the head of post-1968 Czechoslovakia, and Bren, who was the leader of the Soviet Union until into the 70s and who ordered the invasion. So after the invasion, there was a nationwide purge. Everybody in their workplace was given a questionnaire where they had to fill out, do they have relatives in the West? Do they support the invasion? Do they agree the invasion should have taken place, and so forth? Everybody had to fill these out. Then they often had to be interviewed and questioned by fellow colleagues. This purge was particularly keen within television, understandably why it was so ferocious, considering the role that television had played. And once television was seen as cleansed, the regime now had to think about how to use it to map out expectations that the regime had for its citizens. So television would come to play a huge role in normalizing, in making the absurdity of late communism seem normal. But the line between educating, propagating, and entertaining was always fragile. None of this was helped by the fact that the normalization regime itself was like a rerun, basically. The same people, same cast of characters were put back in power. Their aim, however, was to find a formidable popular vehicle for voicing normalization's political, social, and economic imperatives, for defining to the viewing public what communism meant now after 1968. And that vehicle became the television serial. Usually the television serial was, as in Europe it tends to be finite, so it's one season, 12 episodes. And television serials had been popular in Czechoslovakia prior to 1968. But after 1968, their popularity soared. Just to give you a sense of the sort of 1978 Golden Prague Television Awards, head of the drama studios sort of described the television serial now as sort of a mix between Greek drama and a more developed socialist realism. And socialist realism was this theory that under communism, that the arts, literature, painting, so forth, they should all be done in order to to describe, to picture the values and the ideals of communist society. So an art has to work for communism. And this guy announced at the television awards, television dramatic art is becoming a remarkable part of our national culture. It replaces the one-time popular nature of theatre and film and takes over their role of the mass art of the first half of the 20th century. So these were seen really as the new socialist realist art, the new mass art that would work toward communism. These serials showcased normative characters and their regime-friendly interactions. And I'll say a bit more about that when I talk about two different serials. But they presented the idea that the citizen viewer should basically imitate these same interactions. And if they do so, they're going to succeed in this world of normalization in late communism. Now, from the point of view of the regime, it didn't matter whether or not the messages were accepted and internalized by the viewer. If the viewer watched, even if they were resistant, even if they were not, and most people weren't, most people are not for the regime, didn't make them dissidents, but they were not for the regime, and they made fun of it incessantly, but they still went along. And so if they were watching, they received word of what will be rewarded and what will be punished by the normalization regime. From the point of view of viewers, TV viewers, political and social themes that they completely rejected when it was on the news, when a newscaster was talking about what's really important on the agenda at this particular time, be it housing crisis, crises, be it divorce rates, be it lackadaisical behavior at work, an economy that doesn't work. All of these issues, if they were brought up in the news, people switched, and they did studies on this, the regime did, they switched off the TV. But if these same issues were recast through the characters and through the plot lines of television serials, people watched. And so basically, through the television serial, public issues were beamed into viewers' living rooms as shared private experiences. And even at the time, it was sort of understood this was happening, but I think it wasn't fully processed. So, for example, an article in the regular press, Cood, these serials so much resemble our own everyday lives that we're no longer sure of what is art and what is journalism. And effectively, these serials became the ultimate socialist water cooler talk. And that's what in media, that's what you always want, a successful, especially prior to the days of the multi-channels that we have today, The key was that you created something that people would come to work the next day, they'd crowd around the water cooler, and they would talk about it. Okay? That meant popularity in the Eastern Bloc. This meant also not just popularity, but you're discussing the ideas and the themes of these serials. Now, none of this, the power of the television series, really, I think, couldn't have come together had it not been for the talents of one television writer who wrote some of the most famous television serials. His name was Jaroslav Dietl. He became a celebrity as much as his fictional characters did. And so I want to look at two of his television serials. The first one is called Hospital on the Edge of Town. This is the best known of them all, and this serial was broadcast across the Eastern Bloc. If you talk to anybody who grew up during communism in any country in the Eastern Bloc, they will know about this Czech television serial. And in fact, it was so popular that it was even watched in West Germany, which never happened. Usually, I mean, this was also a problem for the communist regimes, that if you lived in certain sort of border areas in the countries in the Eastern Bloc, you could catch Western television signals. And you could, in fact, they try to ban it, but you could buy special sort of little antenna things for your building roofs. And you could actually pull in more Western television signals. It was very rare that anybody in the West would actually want to tune into something on Eastern Bloc TV. But in the case of this serial, they did. And in fact, it was so popular that a second season was co-produced by West Germany with Czechoslovakia. Okay? So that was quite a political coup. Now, as a result, it's often being seen as Dietl's most benign, non-political series. In fact, when people say, oh, Dietl wasn't political, they point to this. After all, it was centered around the trials and tribulations of doctors and nurses at a hospital, a genre we are all very familiar with, right? I mean, more than a dozen that we can count that have been certainly produced here in the US, let alone elsewhere. But some dissidents sometimes did think about these television serials and thought about their allure in some way in comparison to the lack of allure to the dissident scene. And there was an article in one Samizdat press. It was signed anonymously, or rather with a pseudonym, and a witty pseudonym of TV Schauer, which means in German TV watcher. And they argued that the serial is, quote, without a doubt, to rehabilitate the hearsay and experiences encountered in socialist healthcare and to renew the broken public trust in doctors. What does that mean? What that means is that the national healthcare system, even though it was a national healthcare system, that was good, was highly problematic. Poor care, you often had to bribe doctors, nurses to get better care. You had to find a protector. If you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, before you had an operation, you made sure that person connected you with the right people. Money was paid everywhere. These sorts of things. I mean, the way sort of patients were treated was quite terrible in terms of sort of care, bedside manner, and so forth. So there were understandably a lot of complaints. And TV Show was saying this show, which seems so benign, was produced in order for viewers to sort of be persuaded that actually it's not that bad, that the regime cares. And so to make that point, Schauer deconstructed an episode of this serial. And in this episode, there's a false accusation made against a doctor by one of his patients. And Schauer explained, the episode is put together with Dietl's usual bravado. The author of the complaint is as unsympathetic as possible, and the television viewer further knows that the complaint is ridiculous since he saw with his very own television eyes the self-sacrificing nature of the whole hospital collective. Despite that, or rather because of that, the viewer will be taught that even such groundless complaints do not end up in the wastepaper basket. So Dietl's serials were not intended as an exercise in citizens' empowerment, which was Schauer's point. And in fact, Schauer referred to this general phenomenon as the Dietl vision, defining it as the cheerful propagation of the powerlessness experienced on a daily basis by citizens living in communism. The other series I want to talk to you about briefly is one where I think this exercise in disempowerment was given a further bizarre twist in Dietl's last serial before he died, and I think his least known. Just as The Hospital is his best known, this is his least known. It's from 1985, Chef Svatopluk's Quandaries. So this is at a time when real socialism was very much associated with an unmotivated workforce. If for those of you who don't know anything about Eastern Europe, the economic situation of the mid-1980s. Some countries were struggling, but there was some like Czechoslovakia that actually, when you look at it statistically, was not struggling economically, but was struggling rather with labor issues, labor attitudes, and so forth. So the problems within the economy were less about money and distribution and were more about sort of the workforce. So this was a real issue. And this series focused on the work life of restaurant chef Svatopluk Uřádko. And in each episode, Svatopluk faces a challenge at work. And he has to decide how to proceed with the crisis at hand. So for example, like there was a drunken colleague, what to do about a drunken colleague, what to do about a supplier who was thieving, who was skimming off the surface, who was taking materials. What about the female worker who wasn't showing up at work because she was looking after her kids, and so forth. So real-time issues during late communism. And as Svatopluk, the chef, considers his options, the television screen, while you're watching, would freeze. It was then left up to the serial's audience, both those sitting in the studio and those at home, to decide how Chef Svatopluk should proceed. So in the studio, audience members pressed yes or no on their yellow devices. And you could also see that on the yellow devices, big clunky devices, you see also their profession. So the far right, I think the word is the beginning word of pastry chef. Next to that, I believe, is the director of a nursery school. I'm not sure what the next one. So the TV audience could also see the audience, in-studio audience, to actually pressing these and who they were, right? So it was so much wound around the notion of us as workers and how we're working. What's more amazing is at home, television viewers flicked their light switches off or on. And the electric company immediately phoned in the results to the TV studio. And to show just how popular this was, one-time television cameras actually were set up near a typical Prague housing complex so that viewers could see how everyone was participating in the vote, how the housing project went dark and then suddenly lit up. Another dissident, Karel Becka, also writing in Samizdat, saw in this the absurdist theater that was a simulacra of voting under communism, in which choice was presented but made meaningless, because the sequence about which the audience decided was finished off quickly, after which the plot continued as it would have, regardless of any voting. So in other words, the difference between option A and option B was often one single frame, two at most. So, borrowing from the American scholar Lauren Berlant and her work on Reagan's America in the 1980s, I describe the phenomenon created by Dietl's television serials as the televised experience of simultaneously lived private worlds. Following the public politics of the Prague Spring, indeed the infiltration of public space by reformed communists in 1968, the Czechoslovak normalization regime feared public citizenship. They feared the public acting out of citizenship. Consequently, the regime reoriented its efforts toward privatized citizenship, toward defining a post-1968 communism via a shared private sphere, or simultaneously lived private worlds, if you wish, best broadcast through the television serial. So as I said, pressing issues were tackled in this way. So I hope, in conclusion, that I've sort of persuaded you of three things, or let you think about three things. First, that late communism, otherwise known as normalization in Czechoslovakia, that period after 1968 Prague Spring, needs to be treated very differently because it's an entirely different epoch with a distinctly different history. Late communism deserves to be understood separately. We can't really talk about post-war communism. It doesn't make sense. Also, second, that the history of political dissidence is merely one part of a much larger story of the 70s and 80s in the Eastern Bloc. And thirdly, I think that many of us would like to imagine ourselves of having opted to be on the side of the dissidents, among those who had the courage to openly voice dissent. But in all likelihood, we would have all been watching TV and feeling some sense of camaraderie with our favorite characters. So if anybody has questions of any kind, just put your hand up. Yes?
Can you talk just a little bit, and I think this is probably something that's in your book, about the regime's acknowledgement that they also needed to somehow entertain their population? Because that's not something people usually think of when they think about a communist regime, that, oh my God, we have to entertain these people.
Yes, and it was a constant source of panic because, and this is also why so many people watch these television serials. I mean, it was around 80% of the entire country watched every single one of these episodes that I was describing. That's huge. And the reason is because it was really well written, and it was one of the few things that was entertaining on television. And certainly there are I found Central Committee documents amongst the communist leadership talking about this and saying, why are we so boring? Why do we get these talking heads on TV? And then also a lot of people during the 70s and 80s, it was really interesting in the way that the regime sort of had Czechoslovak television become its voice. People saw television as sort of a representation of the regime, or a more benevolent regime, so they would routinely write letters to television. And television, Czechoslovak television, had to create an entire department for these letters to sort them. And the logical thing would have been to exact retribution by basically taking these apartments away from Prague dissidents. And they never did. They took away their telephones, or they harassed them with telephones by calling every 5 minutes. They did things like that, but they never. So revenge was also a very interesting thing. This is the thing, it wasn't Stalinism. Things had to be a little bit more subtle, or one could say a little bit more confused. But obviously, I think pensioners, they were off limits. In terms of the letters from people about the anti-Semitism of certain shows, I know which ones you're talking about. The line was that communism was not anti-Semitic, and in fact was pro-Semite. So I think also behind that myth you could sort of hide, especially a lot of these, they themselves were Jewish who were writing in that these were anti-Semitic approaches. Yeah?
What happened to this type of media after the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Great.
Are there still cases of like those serials or anything?
Oh, great question. I started looking into it because when it started as my dissertation research, and I was asking people, well, what was it? It was just recently, communism was just recently over, and I was saying, well, what was it? What it was like? And people just couldn't. It was very hard to narrate, and because of television programming and the way it also sort of originated in the country, but it would often be shown on other Eastern Bloc countries. It's funny when you get a whole bunch of East Europeans together of a certain generation. They didn't have to have grown up in the same country, speak the same language, but they'll have these touch points that are very similar. Yeah?
I would like to ask about your reflection, like how these days the TV is still like.
I'm sorry, how what?
Your reflection about how these days the TV is still like influencing and helping to regulate or systematize what's happening right now with different economic systems and political systems.
I'm a historian, so so I can't really tell you much about that. But I'm you know, media is something I use or have used in order to talk about certain things and make arguments about certain things. But it's not my focus of study. But there was, interestingly, about 6 years ago, I think it was, there was a very long, very popular, well-done serial about normalization. It was a television serial, a drama, this whole sort of multi-level family, how Prague Spring happens, and then how they move through normalization. And it was really good because, and it came at a time, well, it came at a time where for 20 years after communism, nobody was willing to talk about normalization. Absolutely not willing to talk about it. And this came at a point, and it was a very short point where people actually started to talk about it, and this television serial helped that. It helped promote that discussion. And it was also the fact that it was fictionalized, I think, made it more accessible for people to have that discussion. Because prior to this, there'd been, as these television serials came out of the vaults of Czech television, historians in the Czech Republic were very concerned, and this was, as I say, in sort of the late 90s, very concerned about it. And so they decided they would show these, but with historians explaining everything beforehand, and that just didn't go that well. And they also, throughout the 90s and 2000s, they would have sometimes short bits, they would pull out of the archival vaults just some regular programming from the 70s and 80s, and they'd show it for 15 minutes as a historical point. But it wasn't until that fictionalized version that, again, people really had those family discussions.